The spring of 1974 came in wet and mean across Black Hawk County, Iowa. The frost was barely out of the ground, and the fields were still too soft to carry a tractor. But the talk at the co-op was already running hot. Corn was over $3 a bushel and climbing. Soybeans were pushing $7. You could feel the gold rush fever in the air, thick as the smell of stale coffee and seed corn dust inside the office. I was sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, nursing a cup of the co-op's tar black coffee, mostly just listening. My name is Arthur Jensen, Art to most folks. I was farming the same 240 acres my father had farmed, and his father before him. It wasn't the biggest spread in the county, not by a long shot, but it was mine. Every square inch of it, free and clear. The center of attention, as he usually was these days, was Dale Peterson. Dale was 10 years my junior, all ambition and easy credit. He'd just taken delivery of a brand new International Harvester 1066, the kind with the white deluxe cab, air conditioning, and an 8-track player. It was parked out front, gleaming red under the weak morning sun, its tires still showing the little rubber molding nubs. It made my 1968 Ford F-250 look like a relic from a forgotten age. Dale was holding court, leaning against the counter with a cocky grin. "Banker told me yesterday, 'Dale, you're a fool if you don't expand.' Land's going up 10% a year. Can't lose. I'm putting in a bid on the old Miller place next week, another 160 acres." Old man Hemmings, who'd seen more planting seasons than all of us combined, grunted from his chair. "Interest rates are creeping up, Dale. Gotta watch that." Dale just laughed, a loud, dismissive sound. "You gotta spend money to make money, Bill. This ain't Grandpa's farming anymore. We're businessmen now. It's all about leverage, efficiency. That new 1066 will pull a 6-bottom plow. I can turn over that new ground in half the time. Plant fence, row to fence row." His eyes swept the room and settled on me. "Isn't that right, Art? Or are you still planning on babying that old green tractor of yours through another season?" The room got quiet. Everyone knew my machine. A 1965 John Deere 4220, open station, diesel. It was the last tractor my father bought before the cancer took him. I'd paid it off 6 years ago. It didn't have a cab or a radio, but I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every whine and groan of its engine like it was a part of my own body. I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering. "She runs good, Dale. Does the job." "Does the job?" Dale scoffed, playing to his audience. "Art, that thing's a museum piece. You're burning daylight and fuel doing in 2 passes what I can do in 1. You could trade that thing in, get a nice loan, and buy a real tractor. Increase your yield by 20%. Easy." "My yield is fine," I said, keeping my voice even. "And my tractor is paid for. So is my land. I sleep pretty good at night." A few of the older farmers nodded subtly, but the younger guys were all looking at Dale, mesmerized by the gospel of growth and credit. Dale saw it too and pressed his advantage. "Sleeping good don't put money in the bank," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're sitting on a gold mine, Art, and you're trying to dig it out with a teaspoon. It's 1974, not 1944. A man's got to be aggressive." He slapped a new pair of leather gloves against his palm. "Well, I got to go sign some papers at the bank. You boys have fun talking about the good old days." He walked out, the screen door slamming behind him. The spell was broken, and the room filled with chatter again, but I could feel the pity in their eyes. To them, I was a dinosaur, a man too scared or too stupid to get with the times. I finished my coffee, gave a nod to Bill Hemmings, and walked out into the chilly air. Dale was just climbing up into the palatial cab of his new International. He gave me a little wave, a king from his throne, and fired it up. The turbocharged diesel engine didn't roar to life like my old dear. It hissed, a smooth, powerful sound that spoke of money and modern engineering. He backed out, leaving tracks from the big Firestone radials in the soft gravel. I stood there for a moment, watching him drive off, the morning sun glinting off the perfect red paint. I looked at my old Ford, its paint faded, and a dent in the passenger side door from a stubborn bull. I looked at my worn boots and my calloused hands. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of new tires and the sound of easy horsepower, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I a fool? Was I honoring my father's legacy of caution, or was I just letting the world pass me by? Before we go any further, I have to ask you all out there. Have you ever known a man like me who stuck to his guns when the whole world was telling him he was wrong? A man who valued a paid-off bill more than a shiny new machine? Let me know in the comments below, because I'm telling you, it felt like I was the only one left in the world who thought that way back in '74. I got in my truck, the 360 V8, turned over with a familiar, rumbling cough. It needed new plugs, and the carburetor probably needed a rebuild, but it would get me home. I pulled out onto the county road and headed back to the farm, the image of Dale's new tractor burning in my mind. The doubt was a bitter taste in my mouth, almost as bitter as the coffee. The next few weeks were a blur of cold, greasy work. The ground was still too wet to plough, so I used the time in the shop. My 4020 was a good machine, but it was 9 years old and had thousands of hours on it. Things wore out. That was the nature of iron and steel. First thing was the hydraulic system. It had been getting a little weak on the 3-point hitch, slow to lift the old John Deere 5-bottom plough. I drained the fluid, the thick, amber high-guard oil smelling of hot metal and hard work. I pulled the whole pump assembly, a heavy, awkward chunk of cast iron that I had to wrestle onto the workbench. The manual, its pages soft and stained with the fingerprints of a dozen other repairs, lay open beside it. I spent 2 days meticulously disassembling the pump, laying each gear, seal, and bearing out on a clean rag in the exact order they came off. I found the problem soon enough. A scored piston and a worn-out O-ring, no bigger than a dime, that was letting pressure bleed by. It was a $5 part, causing a $500 headache. While I waited for the parts to come in from the dealer in Waterloo, I went to work on the engine. She was running a little rough, puffing a bit of black smoke on startup. I figured it was the injectors. Pulling them was a delicate job. You had to be clean. One speck of dirt in the fuel system could ruin your whole day or your whole season. I laid out clean rags, scrubbed my hands raw, and carefully disconnected the high-pressure fuel lines, cracking each one loose with a sharp rap on the wrench. One by one, I pulled the injectors and took them over to my test stand, a contraption I'd built myself out of an old bottle jack and a pressure gauge. I clamped an injector in, pumped the handle, and watched the spray pattern. 3 of them were good, atomizing the diesel into a perfect, fine cone of mist. But the other 3 were lazy. They dribbled and sputtered, spitting out streams of fuel instead of a fog. That was my black smoke. That was my lost power. I spent another day taking the bad ones apart, cleaning the tiny nozzles with a brass wire brush, so fine it was like a cat's whisker. I soaked them in carburetor cleaner until they shone, then reassembled them, torquing the caps down just so. While I worked, the world kept turning. Dale Peterson's new 1066 was a constant presence on the horizon. The ground dried out enough for him, a full 2 days before my fields were ready. I could hear the high-pitched turbo whistle of his tractor from my own machine shed, a sound that carried for miles on the spring wind. He was ploughing the Miller place, the land he'd bought right out from under 2 other bidders, paying a price that made old man Hemmings choke on his coffee. My neighbour to the west, Tom Gunderson, stopped by one afternoon. He leaned against the doorframe of my shop, watching me lap the valves on the 4020's head. "Still tinkering with that old girl, Art?" he asked, not unkindly. "She needs a little love now and then," I said, not looking up from my work. The smell of grinding compound was sharp in the air. "Dale was done ploughing yesterday," Tom said. "Said he's putting his corn in tomorrow. I saw him drive by in that thing. It's like a damn spaceship. He was listening to the radio and drinking a pop while he worked." I just grunted and kept at it. Every turn of the lapping tool was a meditation. This was the difference. Dale paid a man in a clean uniform at the dealership to worry about his machine. I paid in sweat and scraped the knuckles. When his tractor broke down, and it would, they all do, he'd be on the phone, waiting, losing precious hours, precious days. When mine broke, I knew how to fix it. That had to be worth something, but it was hard to remember that when I finally got the 4020 back together and out in the field. The engine fired up with a healthy, deep-throated roar. The black smoke gone. The hydraulics lifted the heavy plough with a new swiftness. I felt a surge of pride. I had done this, with my own 2 hands. Then I looked across the fence line to the old Miller place. Dale was already out there with a 12-row planter, covering ground at a speed I could only dream of. I was just starting to plough. He was planting. I was sweating in the open air, the diesel fumes in my face, my ears ringing with the engine's bark. He was in his air-conditioned cab, probably listening to Paul Harvey on the radio. The scorn wasn't always spoken aloud. It was in the way people looked at you at the feed mill, the way the younger farmers would stop talking when you walked up. They saw me as a relic, a man clinging to the past while they were rocketing into the future on a wave of credit and new technology. My wife, Sarah, felt it too. She never said a word against me, but I saw it in her eyes when she came back from the Ladies' Aid meeting at church. She heard the talk. She heard about the Petersons' new color television, the new station wagon Dale had bought his wife. We were still driving our 10-year-old Chevy Biscayne and watching a black and white set with a coat hanger for an antenna. That summer, during a dry spell in July, my old Gleaner E combine broke down right in the middle of wheat harvest. A main bearing on the cylinder went out. It screamed like a dying animal and then seized up solid. It was the worst possible time. Every day the wheat sat in the field under the hot sun. It got drier, more brittle. The head started to shatter, dropping kernels on the ground. It was like watching dollar bills float away on the wind. I worked for 2 straight days and nights, sleeping for an hour or 2 at a time on a greasy blanket on the shop floor. I had to pull half the guts out of that combine to get to the bearing. It was hot, dirty, miserable work. On the second night, covered in grease and sweat, a part I was trying to hammer into place slipped, and I smashed my thumb flat. The pain was white-hot, blinding. I sat down hard on the concrete floor, cursing and cradling my hand, feeling utterly defeated. Through the open door of the shop, I could see the heat lightning flickering on the horizon, and I could hear the steady hum of a combine. It was Dale, custom harvesting for a neighbor, working under the big halogen lights of his new John Deere 7700. He was making money while I was bleeding on my own floor. The bitterness of it was a physical thing, a sickness in my gut. But I got up, wrapped my thumb in a rag, and got back to work. I had to. There was no other choice. The good years rolled on. From 74 into 78, it seemed like the music would never stop. Corn prices stayed high, land values shot through the roof, and the banks were practically begging farmers to take their money. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts was on the television telling us to plant, fence row to fence row, that food was a weapon in the Cold War. It was our patriotic duty to get big, to borrow, to produce. And Dale Peterson was the poster boy for the whole movement. He bought another 80 acres in 76, and then the adjoining 120 in 77. He was farming nearly 600 acres now. His new 1066 was already looking small, so he traded it for a massive international harvester, 4386, a big four-wheel drive articulated beast that looked like it could pull the whole damn county. He built a new machine shed, a huge Morton building that dwarfed my old barn. He put up 2 new grain bins with automatic augers. Every time you drove past his place, it seemed like there was a new piece of equipment sitting in the yard, the dealer's sticker still fresh on the window. Dale became a local celebrity. The Waterloo Courier did a whole feature on him. The face of modern farming. There was a picture of him and his family standing in front of the giant new tractor, all of them smiling. He talked about amortization schedules and debt-to-asset ratios. He made it all sound so scientific, so inevitable. He was a businessman, a producer, a vital part of the American economic engine, and I just kept on doing what I was doing. My 240 acres felt smaller and smaller with each passing year, an island of stubbornness in a sea of progress. My profits were modest, but they were steady. The high grain prices were good for me too, but I didn't leverage them. I didn't borrow a dime. Instead, I did something that seemed downright crazy to everyone else. I took the extra money and I paid off the last of the farm's mortgage, a note my father had taken out 20 years prior. I'll never forget the day I drove to the bank and handed the check to old Mr. Abernathy. He was the bank president, a man in his late 60s with wispy white hair and a kind face. He'd known my father well. He looked at the check, then up at me over his spectacles. "Arthur," he said, his voice quiet, "you're the only farmer in this county who's paid anything extra on his principal in the last 3 years. Most of them are borrowing more." "I like to sleep at night, Mr. Abernathy," I told him. He stamped the paperwork with a heavy, final-sounding thud and slid it across the desk to me. "Paid in full." The words were beautiful. He shook my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Your father would be proud, son. Very proud." Walking out of that bank, I felt 10 feet tall. The land was truly mine now. The house, the barns, the fields stretching out to the horizon, no one could take them from me. It was a feeling of security so deep and profound, it was almost dizzying. But that feeling didn't last long. Back in the real world, I was still just Art Jensen, the guy with the old 4020. At the next church potluck, Dale's wife, Karen, was showing off a new diamond ring. She talked loudly about their upcoming vacation to Hawaii. Sarah was standing beside me, holding a Tupperware bowl of potato salad, and I saw the look on her face. A quiet, wistful sadness. She never complained, but I knew it was hard on her. It was one thing for me to be stubborn, but it was another for my family to feel poor because of it. Dale cornered me by the dessert table. He was heavier now, softer around the middle, his face flushed with success and good living. "Heard you paid off the farm, Art," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Good for you. A little sentimental milestone." "Felt like more than that to me," I said. Sure, he said, waving his hand dismissively. "But you see, you're thinking about it all wrong. That farm, that's your equity. You're sitting on $500,000 of collateral, and it's not doing a thing for you. It's dead money. I've borrowed against my land 3 times now. That's how I bought the Miller place. That's how I got the 4366. You're not using your assets." I just looked at him. We were speaking 2 different languages. To him, the land was a number on a balance sheet, a tool for acquiring more debt and more machines. To me, it was everything. It was my father's sweat, my grandfather's back-breaking labor. It was the place I was born, and the place I would die. It wasn't collateral. It was home. "I'm happy with what I've got, Dale," I said, and walked away. But his words, "dead money," stuck with me. The world was telling me I was a failure, a man with no vision. I was maintaining, but I wasn't growing. And in the America of the late 1970s, if you weren't growing, you were dying. By the fall of 1979, the first faint cracks began to appear in the golden facade. The news on the radio wasn't all good anymore. They were talking about a new man at the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. They were talking about runaway inflation and a wage price spiral. And they started talking about the prime interest rate. It was a term most of us farmers had never paid much attention to. It had always been low, stable. But now it was moving. Up. It was 10%, then 12%. By Christmas, it was 15% and climbing. The chatter at the co-op started to change. The swagger was gone from some of the younger guys' voices. They talked in hushed tones about their operating loans for the next spring. The variable rates on their loans, the ones they'd signed so eagerly a few years back, were suddenly a pair of concrete boots. One cold evening in January of 1980, I was in town picking up some salt for the driveway. I stopped at the diner for a piece of pie. Dale Peterson was there, sitting in a booth by himself, staring into a cup of coffee. His face looked pale and drawn. He didn't look like the confident captain of industry from the newspaper article anymore. He just looked tired. He nodded at me, a quick, jerky motion, but didn't say a word. I sat at the counter, and as I was leaving, I passed Mr. Abernathy, the banker, who was on his way in. He stopped me, putting a hand on my arm. "Arthur," he said, his voice low and grave. "Tough times are coming. I'm seeing loan applications, renewals. These interest rates are going to break some people." He glanced over at Dale's booth. "You were wise, son. Wiser than any of us knew." I just nodded, paid for my pie, and went outside. The winter air was sharp and cold, and it felt like it was cleansing the world. I stood by my old truck and looked up and down the quiet main street of our little town. Something was changing. The wind had shifted. For 5 years I'd felt like a fool, a man left behind by progress. But standing there, with the banker's solemn words echoing in my ears, I felt the first glimmer of a different, colder reality. I looked out toward the edge of town, in the direction of Dale's farm. The big Morton building was silhouetted against the winter sky, a monument to a dream that was about to become a nightmare. The party was ending, and the bill was coming due. The spring of 1980 broke hot and early. The ground thawed fast, but the rains never came. By May, the sky was a pale, bleached-out blue, day after day. The fields I'd so carefully ploughed and planted turned to a fine, grey powder. The young corn, which should have been knee-high by the 4th of July, was stunted and yellow, its leaves curled tight like little cigars, trying to hold on to what little moisture they had. The old-timers called it a flash drought, a sudden, vicious, dry spell that sucked the life right out of the soil. The heat was relentless, but a different kind of chill was settling over the county. The prime interest rate, a number we'd never cared about before, was now the first thing we looked for in the paper. It hit 18%, then 20%. The cost of money had become insane. The easy credit that had fueled the boom years was now a hangman's noose, and it was tightening around the necks of farmers all over the Midwest. Dale Peterson's operation was the first to show the strain. His big four-wheel drive International, the 4360 was a thirsty beast. It burned through diesel at a terrifying rate as he tried to work his parched fields. Then, one blistering afternoon in late June, it broke down. I saw it from my own fence line, sitting dead in the middle of his soybean field, a silent red giant under the merciless sun. The word at the co-op was that the transmission's hydraulic control module had failed. It wasn't a simple mechanical part you could unbolt and replace. It was a complex, almost electronic component, buried deep in the guts of the machine. The local dealership didn't have the tools or the training to fix it. They had to fly a specialist in from Moline. For a week, the tractor sat there. A week of perfect cultivating weather, wasted. Dale's weeds were getting ahead of his beans. I saw him out there one evening with his wife, Karen, trying to go after them with an old two-row cultivator, pulled by a tired Farmall H that must have belonged to his father. It was a pitiful sight, like trying to bail out the ocean with a teacup. He, who had mocked my 40-20, was now forced to rely on a machine 40 years its senior. The specialist from Moline finally came and went, leaving Dale with a bill that, according to the gossip, was over $5,000. That was more than I'd paid for my 40-20 brand new. Dale got the big tractor running again, but the damage was done. The weeds had taken their toll on his yield, and the cost of the repair had eaten a huge hole in his operating budget. The drought broke in August, with a series of violent thunderstorms that did more harm than good. The rain came down in sheets, washing away topsoil and flattening the weakened corn stalks. The rest of the harvest season was a grim, muddy slog. Yields were down by a third across the county. For me, it was a painful loss. I'd have to tighten my belt, but I'd survive. My bins wouldn't be full, but my land was paid for. My machinery was mine. I had no notes coming due at the bank. For Dale, and dozens like him, it was a catastrophe. A poor crop, rock-bottom prices, and 21% interest. It was a mathematical impossibility. The first farm auction notices started appearing in the paper that fall. They were small at first, just a few lines in the classifieds for farmers on the margins. But as winter set in, the notices grew larger, more frequent. They started to have names we all knew. Good men, hard-working men who had believed the gospel of get big or get out. The pressure on Dale was immense. He looked like a ghost. I'd see him at the co-op, his eyes hollow, his shoulders slumped. He'd buy a few bags of feed and leave without talking to anyone. The cocky, confident grin was gone, replaced by a permanent, haunted frown. His empire, built on the shifting sands of credit and inflated land values, was crumbling. The bank, the same one that had called him a fool not to expand, was now calling him every day, its voice cold and unforgiving. The men who had been his friends and advisers were now his executioners. The ground beneath his feet, the very land he'd leveraged to build his dream, was about to swallow him whole. The winter of 1981 was the longest of my life. The cold was bitter, but it was nothing compared to the chill of fear that had settled over the countryside. It wasn't just the interest rates anymore. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. It was meant to be a political statement, a shot across the bow of the Kremlin. But for us, for the farmers who had been told to plant fence row to feed the world, it was a bullet to the heart. Our biggest customer was gone overnight. The price of corn collapsed, falling below $2 a bushel. It was costing us more to grow it than we could sell it for. That was the final blow. The banks, which had loaned money based on land valued at $2,000 an acre, suddenly saw that same land being worth less than $1,000. The collateral was gone. They panicked. They started calling in loans, refusing to extend operating credit for the next season. The foreclosure notices in the paper went from a trickle to a flood. Dale Peterson's notice appeared on a Tuesday in early March. It was a full-page ad, stark and brutal. Public auction, it read, by order of the Black Hawk County Savings and Loan. It listed everything. 580 acres, more or less. The house, the big Morton building, and the equipment. A 1979 International 4366 tractor, a 1978 John Deere 17700 combine, a 6-bottom plow, a 12-row planter. Every piece of machinery that had once been a symbol of his success was now just an item on a liquidation list. It was the public dissection of a man's life. The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a raw wind that cut through your coat. The whole county was there, it seemed. Not out of spite, but out of a kind of morbid curiosity and a shared sense of dread. We were all standing on the edge of the same cliff. Dale had just been the one to fall first. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands jammed in my pockets. Dale's farmstead, once so pristine and impressive, looked worn and tired. The equipment was lined up in neat rows, washed and polished one last time, like soldiers on final parade. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice a relentless, hypnotic chant that turned dreams into dollars and cents. They sold the small stuff first. The tools from the shop, the fuel barrels, the wagon gears. Neighbors bought things for pennies on the dollar, their faces grim. No one looked happy to be there. It felt like a funeral. I saw Dale standing by the side of the machine shed, alone. His wife and kids were nowhere to be seen. He was wearing a thin jacket, shivering in the wind, his face ashen. He watched as the life he had built was sold off, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were watching a movie about someone else. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, was there, looking uncomfortable in his city suit. He avoided everyone's eyes, staring down at the clipboard in his hands. He wasn't a bad man, but he was part of a system that had no room for mercy. While all this was happening, I was back on my own place, getting by. The low prices hurt, but they didn't kill me. I had a small herd of cattle that brought in a little cash. Sarah had planted a huge garden, and we canned enough vegetables to last us through the winter. We didn't buy anything we didn't absolutely need. I patched my own tires, rebuilt my own carburetor, and welded my own broken machinery. My old 4020, covered in grease and faded paint, was my salvation. It asked for nothing but fuel, oil, and my own 2 hands to keep it running. It was an honest machine from an honest time. It owed no man a thing, and neither did I. That simple fact was the rock I clung to while the flood waters rose around me. I survived not because I was smarter, but because I was scared. I had remembered my father's warnings about the lean years, and I had honored them. They got to the big-ticket items in the afternoon. The John Deere 7700 combine, the one that had worked through the night while I was fixing my old gleaner, sold for less than half of what Dale had paid for it. Then they came to the 4366, his pride and joy. It sat there, huge and silent, its tires caked with the mud of its last failed season. "All right, folks, here she is," the auctioneer barked, his voice tinny through the loudspeaker. "The big one, 4-wheel drive, duals all around, 3-point hitch, air conditioning that'll freeze you out in July. What'll you give for this powerhouse?" He started the bidding high. The crowd was silent. No one had that kind of money anymore. No one wanted a tractor that expensive to maintain, that thirsty for fuel. The auctioneer dropped the price. And again. And again. The silence grew awkward. This machine, this monument to the gospel of growth, was an anchor that no one wanted to be tied to. It was a relic of a boom that had gone bust. Dale, who had been watching with that same detached look, suddenly seemed to break. He turned and walked away, disappearing behind the machine shed, unable to watch the final humiliation. And in that moment, all the resentment, all the quiet anger I had felt toward him over the years, just vanished. All I saw was a broken man who had chased a dream the whole world had told him to chase, only to have it turn on him and devour him. He wasn't my rival anymore. He was just my neighbor. The auction for the land came last. They sold it off in parcels, the 160 acres of the old Miller place, the 120 acres to the north. The prices were heartbreakingly low. Men who had lost their own farms were there, hoping to pick up a piece of someone else's tragedy on the cheap. Finally, they came to the last parcel, the original 80 acres, the home place, the piece of ground where Dale had grown up, where his father had farmed before him. It included the house, the old barn, and the new machine shed. The bidding started. It was slow, hesitant. A few local investors threw in bids, their faces impassive. I saw Tom Gunderson, my neighbor, shake his head and drop out. The price stalled at a number that was a fraction of its worth just 2 years before. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. Do I hear another bid? Going once? Going twice? I felt a nudge in my ribs. It was Sarah. She had come to stand beside me, her face etched with worry. I hadn't even noticed her arrive. She looked at me, then at the auctioneer, then back at me. She didn't say a word, but I knew what she was thinking. We had some money saved. Not a lot, but enough. It was the profit from those good years. Money I hadn't poured back into new iron or more land. It was sitting in a savings account at Mr. Abernathy's bank, earning a pittance of interest. It was our security, our safety net. Sold, the auctioneer would say in the next breath. And that piece of ground, a piece of our community's history, would belong to a stranger from the city who would never feel its soil between his fingers. I thought of my father. I thought of his words about being a neighbor first and a farmer second. I looked over at the machine shed where Dale had disappeared. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs, and I raised my hand. My voice came out hoarse, louder than I intended. Yes. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, his eyes wide with surprise. I've got a bid from Art Jensen, he yelled. The crowd turned as one, a sea of faces staring at me. I could feel their shock. Art Jensen, the man with the old tractor, the man who never borrowed a dime, was bidding on Dale Peterson's home place. The investor who held the high bid looked irritated. He conferred with his partner, then gave a curt shake of his head. He was out. Going once, the auctioneer shouted, pointing a finger at me. Going twice. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. Sold, he slammed his hand down on his podium. To Arthur Jensen. A murmur went through the crowd. I felt dizzy. My hand was shaking. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. I had just spent nearly every penny of our life savings. I owned Dale Peterson's home. I found him in the old barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the empty stalls where his father's milk cows had once stood. The place smelled of old hay and dust and defeat. He didn't look up when I walked in. I suppose you came to tell me when you want me out, he said, his voice flat and empty. No, Dale, I said, my voice quiet. That's not why I came." I stood there for a long moment, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light coming through the cracks in the walls. "I'm not a landlord," I finally said. "I'm a farmer, and this land needs a farmer on it. Someone who knows it. Someone who belongs here." He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a confusion that was almost painful to see. "What are you saying, Art?" "I'm saying I'll rent it to you," I said. "The house, the barn, the 80 acres. For a share of the crop. A fair share. We can work out the details later. You can stay. You and Karen and the kids. You can stay." He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The fight had gone out of him. But now, a flicker of something else appeared in his eyes. Disbelief. Hope. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just shook his head slowly, and then he put his face in his hands and began to weep. Not loud, but with the deep, silent, shoulder-shaking sobs of a man who had lost everything and had just been handed back a piece of his soul. I stood there awkwardly for a moment, then quietly turned and walked out, leaving him alone with his grief and his gratitude. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm economy slowly healed. Dale and I became partners, in a way. He farmed his 80 acres, and I farmed my 2 for 40. We shared equipment. His knowledge of the new hybrids and chemicals, combined with my cautious, debt-free approach, made a good team. He never got back to 600 acres, but he found something better. He found peace. The swagger was gone forever, replaced by a quiet humility and a deep, abiding wisdom. The community changed, too. The men who survived the crisis were different. The talk at the co-op was no longer about leverage and expansion. It was about soil health and crop rotation and fixing your own machinery. They started looking at me differently. They'd stop by my shop, asking for advice on how to rebuild a water pump or where to find a bearing for an old combine. I wasn't the dinosaur anymore. I was the one who had weathered the storm. I never got rid of the 4020. She's still in the shed. Paint faded to a pale green, the seat cracked and patched with duct tape. My son, Mark, farms the land with me now. He's got a newer tractor, a John Deere 44440 with a cab and a radio, but it's a 10-year-old machine he bought used, and he paid cash for it. Just the other day, he was in the shop with his own boy, my grandson, little 5-year-old James. They were watching me work on the 4020, changing the fuel filters. "Grandpa?" James asked, his eyes wide with wonder as I bled the air from the fuel lines. "Why do you keep this old tractor? It's so loud." I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and smiled. I looked at Mark, and he smiled back, a knowing look passing between us. I knelt down so I was eye level with my grandson. "Well, James," I said, putting a hand on the tractor's warm hood. "This old machine taught me a very important lesson. It taught me that it's not about having the newest or the biggest or the fanciest thing. It's about owning what you have. It's about the freedom that comes from not owing anyone a single dime." I picked him up and set him on the big fender. "This tractor," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "doesn't just represent a way of farming. It represents a way of living. It's not about being rich. It's about being free." He didn't understand, not really. But one day, he would. I looked out the open door of the shop, across the fields that stretched out to the horizon, green and full of promise. The land was still here. We were still here. And the quiet wisdom of old iron and paid-for bills was the legacy I would leave them. It was a legacy worth more than all the money in the world.